Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Tuesday, February 25th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with US Bureau Chief Jacob Magid, who is currently in Israel. Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Jessica. Be here.
It is good to see you here on this ground. It is day 508 of the war. This morning, the family and kibbutz Nir Oz community of Oded Lifshitz is burying the 84-year-old who was killed in captivity in Gaza. We'll talk about all the latest in the hostage deal, including comments made by a senior Hamas official, what's being said on the diplomatic front, and obviously particularly from the U.S., and all of that after a quick break. Okay, so Jacob, let's start with U.S. President Donald Trump's Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, who said a couple of days ago that he would be, he's coming to the region tomorrow, trying to negotiate an extension of the first phase of the ceasefire. And that was your focus, that it was the first time that it was said formally or more formally in a way that it had not been said before. That was the gist that I was getting from what you were writing. Tell us what your thoughts were about that.
Right. So the extension of phase one, this was, I think, becoming increasingly an Israeli idea that we can't really, in the current political makeup of the Israeli government right now, negotiate a phase two. Even hold negotiations for phase two is going to be difficult because it includes an end to the war, which is not willing to talk about right now, given his coalition partners. So instead, the point is to try to get more hostages out within some sort of phase one framework. And that still has to be negotiated. And that's now what Steve Witkoff is agreeing to come out to the region and do. So he'll arrive in, I believe, Israel. He's going to leave on Wednesday and arrive. His first stop will be in Israel. He's going to go to Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, among other countries. I think I was told 5 countries is likely the scenario. And basically, I think his first stop is in Israel because I think that's the hardest party right now to get on board about these talks in terms of the fact that Israel's in a place where it's more willing to resume the war. We've seen the buildup of troops along the Gaza border, more talk, and even a green light from the Trump administration, I think, to head in that direction in a lot of ways, the way that Trump talks about his disgust with Hamas, whereas Hamas is a much more desperate situation, it seems like, and you're seeing the comments from some of the leadership that we can talk about. But so with this goal of trying to get phase one, Witkoff heads to the region. I'm told, speaking to a senior Arab diplomat a couple hours ago, that there is optimism that we can get at least past this week, which is really still phase one, the original phase one. We have 4 bodies who are supposed to come out on Thursday of hostages who are slain in captivity. But Israel is not expected to get those bodies out unless it releases these 602, I believe, Palestinian security prisoners who it was supposed to release on Saturday, but then held off on that decision and citing all the very grotesque Hamas ceremonies that have been taking place in Gaza with and the botched release of the best children, and the family, I should say. And that gave Israel the willingness to violate the deal in some ways by not releasing the 600. And it even got the backing afterwards from the US. The White House issued a statement saying it supports Israel's decision due to the Hamas handling of the hostage release ceremonies. I think right now, the negotiations that are taking place to try to get these 4 for 600 are about whether or not you can get a commitment from Hamas to not hold ceremonies again. My understanding is that they already had that commitment last in the previous release of bodies, and then that's a commitment from the people abroad, Hamas leaders, but the people on the ground and Hamas have a different way of going about things. And I think that's what one mediator told me, is that the people on the ground just decided to hold these ceremonies regardless of what those abroad wanted, and that infuriated Israel. It violated agreements that were apparently reached. And now they're trying to see if we can get a deal to not allow more ceremonies that have really infuriated Israel and the U.S. And my understanding is that Israel wants to hold off on releasing those 600 security prisoners until the 4 are released without ceremonies. They don't want to only have to trust a Hamas commitment. I think we're moving in that direction of maybe to get something and a deal on there. And then from there, Witkoff is going to be tasked with, do you have maybe 1 hostage released, 2 hostages released for, I don't know how many security prisoners. Is it several hundred?
Right. Jacob, we're talking about a trickle. Mm-hmm.
Yes, not large numbers, and I don't know how long this can last because Hamas's only leverage is to have these hostages in its hand. So the more it gives up without getting a commitment to end the war, which is what Israel is refusing to give, the less likely it's going to want to release hostages. So I think it's going to be a very difficult negotiation for Steve, and that's what I think he'll be quite busy over the next few days.
Jacob, let me ask you this. You referred to this, a sentence or two ago, basically about the hostage release ceremonies in Gaza, that you also wrote a piece that saying that those ceremonies, which are grotesque and obviously they've reached this point where that's essentially becoming one of the negotiation points. But you wrote that they've also significantly harmed the terror group's chances of remaining in power in Gaza, which is taking it many steps further. You had that from two international diplomats. So tell us about that conversation.
Sure. So the concept of these ceremonies, I think Hamas is trying to demonstrate that it still is very much the only one in power in Gaza, and undisputably so. They're obviously doctored, and Al Jazeera works with them to make it seem like they're much bigger, where we have these, it seems like there might be tens of thousands of people there when it's oftentimes really just several hundred. But still, they are a clear show of force. The flags and the way that they treat the hostages, etc. And it's accurate to say that they are the only power in Gaza right now. Israel was not able was unwilling to advance a viable alternative, whether how likely that would have been to actually succeed. But there's nobody else there besides Hamas, and the ceremonies prove that. But I think they went a step too far, is what these two, one senior Arab diplomat and one senior EU diplomat told me, basically saying that now there's this feeling that this is not acceptable, that Hamas is the only power in Gaza. Whereas before, it wasn't necessarily acceptable, but it was something that these diplomats said that they were resigned to accepting, especially in the Arab world. I spoke to a lot of Arab officials who just said there's no way to actually simply completely defeat Hamas, especially without a viable alternative, given that they like to say it's an idea, and it's not just it's very deeply rooted. But they mainly just point to the fact that Israel tried for 15 months and wasn't able to do so, and that over 15 months of war. So returning to war, the idea that that's going to be what's going to be able to topple Hamas if you haven't really succeeded, they don't really buy that. So they were just accepting the fact that Hamas might not be necessarily governing Gaza. There have been lots of signals, and more so in recent days, that they're willing to maybe give up governance in Gaza. Whether it gives up its weapons, it's still going to be very difficult to do. I think it's, again, not showing too many signs and it's willing to do so, even though Moussa Abu Marzouk, a senior official, did hint at it. Again, though, I think that's going to be harder. So, but because of these ceremonies, we've had Trump administration pressure skyrocket to a point where I think they are no longer willing to accept any sort of Hamas presence in Gaza at all. And you're seeing more and more comments about that. And I think that, coupled with Steve Witkoff having just recently watched, when he was in Israel, he watched the footage of what Hamas did on October 7th, that compilation video of about 45 minutes. I think that, and then seeing these grotesque videos, the ceremonies week after week, I think the U.S. has turned to a point where they're not going to allow the Arab world to accept the Hamas scenario in Gaza. Again, it's easier said than done, but it's just notable that these diplomats are saying there's now a shift and we're being forced to try to come up with a solution that's going to be very difficult to come about.
But Jacob, going back to, you mentioned Moussa Abu Marzouk, who is a senior Hamas politician, who then says to the New York Times, I believe this came out on Sunday, that he would not have backed the October 7th invasion and onslaught if he'd known what the consequences would be for the Gaza Strip. And again, as you pointed out, he's someone who is not in Gaza. He sits outside of Gaza. But what are we to take from this statement? In other words, the timing of it, the fact that he said it to the New York Times, knowing that, of course, it would then be spread all over the place. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, said it to our former colleague Adam Razgan, who used to work for us at the Times of Israel. So it's a fun scoop for him right there.
That's right. Got his start.
Big story. I think Abu Marzouk, as you mentioned, abroad, but he's extremely senior. He used to be the top official of Hamas, and then still remains a critical part of its negotiating team. So to dismiss this as just like the view of one person, I think is going too far. It does show that there are some people, or at least one of the most people in Hamas is rethinking how October 7th played out and saying that had we known it, it's kind of similar to what Hassan Nasrallah said after the Second Lebanon War, also saying, had I known how brutal the war would be, I don't necessarily think we would have carried out an initial attacks that launched it. So you're having this, at least with one senior official, shows that there is somewhat of a variety of opinions in Hamas on this issue. I think you did see the terror organization very quickly walk it back, first saying, well, he didn't say exactly that, and then just denying that he said any of it, which I don't think is the case. I think they're trying to cover their bases right now. But it is interesting. I think it's the reality we're also seeing right now is that the Hamas is feeling the pressure in a lot of ways. We saw it in the way that they scrambled to return Shiri Bibas after the Mujahideen, this, I guess, the ISIS faction in Gaza, you could call it, for lack of better terms. The way that they handled that situation and brought back the wrong body and that horrible story. The Hamas acted very quickly there, and now you've seen Moussa Abu Marzouk even days before this was talking about we're open to having dialogue with the U.S., which is not something that you would necessarily expect. I don't think the U.S. will agree to it, but you're seeing a change in tone. I think it's because they really are possibly concerned about this with the Trump administration about what they might accept. They're feeling the heat from the Arab world as well, who you're having more and more leaders talking about the need for Hamas to step aside. And I guess this is maybe one strategy of dealing with it. There are other strategies that will be to double down and say that no, October 7th was legitimate and we would do it again if we had to. But Moussa Abu Marzouk is clearly taking a different route. Take it with a grain of salt, but I think it's indicative of how the thought process is looking at Hamas and how it's responding to, I think, the entry of Trump into the equation.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we're back, we'll shift a little bit over to what happened at the UN, at the General Assembly. So stay with us. Okay, so, sticking with some of the same players, Israel, the U.S., but Russia as well. Israel joined the U.S. and Russia. You wrote about this in voting against a UN General Assembly resolution that called to reaffirm Ukraine's territorial integrity. So basically, backing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is pretty significant, I would think, that you have Israel backing Russia on its invasion of Ukraine. And of course, the U.S. is joining in this as well. So what are your sort of diplomatic opinions about this? What are we really seeing here? What does it really mean?
So I don't know if can go so far as to say that they're backing the Russian invasion. What this was just a Ukrainian resolution that the U.S. really did not want to move forward. And I guess they tried to hold negotiations to try and convince Ukraine not to advance this resolution, and which is basically condemning Russia. You obviously see a shift in how the U.S. is looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's a pretty big 180 in terms of the backing that it used to give Ukraine. We're now seeing a very different approach in order to try to bring an end to the war. So the U.S. couldn't convince Ukraine to put down this resolution, to step aside from the resolution. So it moves forward and it puts the U.S. in a place where it still is going to to vote against it. This is just at the General Assembly, not a Security Council, so the veto isn't really relevant here. It was always going to pass, but it's more symbolic. But the fact to see the U.S. join Russia, for the most part, but also North Korea and other countries in backing or voting against a resolution on Ukraine is really shocking, given how you've seen the U.S. and Russia really at odds completely at the UN specifically for the past few years under the Biden administration. And I think Israel has taken this position where it doesn't want to cross at all with the Trump administration, and is very much, when it was Biden, they also largely voted with Ukraine. There was initial parts in the beginning where they were trying to stay a bit more neutral as they tried to deal with the delicate situation of the airspace over Syria and Russia's control of it. But now I think they're not willing to take any chances with the Trump administration, and it shows how much leverage the Trump administration really has over Israel in terms of that this is something that Israel is willing to do. I think it goes against, in a lot of ways, the foreign policy that it had been advancing for the past year of slowly moving toward Ukraine and backing its fight against Russia. Now, obviously, it'll be interesting to see how Ukraine responds to this Israeli decision. Again, it's mainly symbolic, but I think these kinds of issues were very sensitive in the previous U.S. administration. And I could imagine when Israel comes to Ukraine for possible assistance or vice versa, this issue is going to come up as something that Ukraine won't forget necessarily.
Right. I would imagine so. Really a shift in that sense. Well, thanks for that, Jacob. And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always drop us an email, podcast@timesofisrael.com. And of course, feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, have yourselves a good day.